thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, some of the most fundamental questions of all today. What is evil, and who are we, anyway? Simon Baron Cohen, the psychologist and psychiatrist, is here to challenge the idea of human evil. It is, he believes, a phrase which hides the real story, which is a radical lack of empathy in some people, a story which can be traced in the brain. Gwen Adshead is a consultant forensic psychotherapist at Broadmoor, working with some of the most dangerous people in the country. She defends the use of the word evil, while Val McDermid, one of the country's most successful and lauded crime writers, brings a novelist's eye to the question of empathy and evil. You may have noticed, however, that responsibility for evil or anything else can hardly be disentangled from the question of identity. Who are we, really, to be blamed or praised? Julian Baggini's new book, The Ego Trick, argues that we are not a core, a single self, but a bundle, a series of stories. If somebody does something that's out of character, well, what is character? Let's start with Simon and the theory of empathy. Simon, we, I guess, are mostly familiar with the idea that if you don't understand or you're not interested in what is going on in other people's minds, then you are likely to be socially inept and possibly also to be cruel. We can see that. But you argue that there is a specific series of actions in the brain or functions in the brain which adds up to what you call an empathy circuit.
That's right. I think what's been exciting over the last 5 to 10 years in neuroscience is that we've made real progress in identifying which regions of the brain are involved when somebody is trying to figure out what someone else is thinking or feeling, or responding to someone else's thoughts and feelings. And that's really my everyday working definition of empathy, the recognition part, recognising someone else's mental state, but also the reaction, the response, caring about someone else's mental state.
And you started on this project thinking back to the Nazi treatment of Jews and the Holocaust and asking yourself why it was, how it was that people could do such unspeakable things to other people.
That's right. I mean, for someone who's Jewish, as I am, it's a significance that never really goes away right through your life, even if you haven't experienced it firsthand. So the question about how people are capable of acts of cruelty towards other human beings is a puzzle. But for me, I'm a working cognitive neuroscientist, so it's also a puzzle because we need science to be able to explain behaviour, even the extreme acts. So in a sense, what neuroscience has been doing is looking at which parts of the brain empathy may be operating in. And the short answer is it's not in a single part, it seems to be distributed across a whole network of regions. And in my new book, I identify 10 different regions of the brain, which I call the empathy circuit. And if different parts of that circuit go down in different ways, you can produce different outcomes of unempathic behaviour.
So this is something that you can actually observe in the brain, and also it has some relation to how people have been brought up. It's not simply, as it were, a disease, a malfunction of the brain. It's something caused by upbringing.
Well, there are two separate issues. So one is that we all have degrees of empathy. So empathy isn't all or none. It comes by degrees. And the people who catch the media's fascination and draw public horror are people at 0 degrees. But actually, people who are at 0 degrees don't always commit cruel acts, and certainly people on the autistic spectrum are not, as a group, more likely to commit cruel acts, even though they struggle with empathy, struggle with understanding other people. But, so the idea is that we're all somewhere on an empathy curve, a bell curve, and part of what the book tries to do is understand what determines where you end up on that empathy spectrum. You mentioned upbringing. And I'm sure we'll have some discussion about that, because there's plenty of evidence that early experience of neglect or even worse, abuse, does damage your empathy as a teenager and even as an adult.
You don't get what you call the pot of gold at the core of your being.
Yeah,
we'll come to cause of being in a moment, but...
That's right. So I use this phrase, an internal pot of gold, which is nothing more than a metaphor, obviously, but it's really to refer to John Bowlby's theory of attachment, because it's so fundamental, and I think it's a message that I certainly think we should never tire of hearing, namely that how children treat their infants and their young children has profound effects on how they turn out later. And a child who has the benefit of secure attachment, which is another word for trusting, affectionate relationships with parents, has an incredible birthright. They're able to trust relationships right through their life. And Bowlby underlined that the delinquents he was studying had difficult early childhoods and had difficulties trusting or empathizing with others.
I can understand how this way of thinking can help perhaps analyse killers, murderers, and possibly change their treatment. I'd like to come on to that. But how does it account for, as it were, group evil? We started off earlier on talking about Nazis. Now, a group of German soldiers might commit some atrocity, and in that group there might be people with quite high degrees of empathy, but who had nonetheless been subjected to a kind of groupthink, propaganda and so on, and it doesn't seem to me that your theory accounts for that.
Well, what I discuss in the book is that there are many ways to lose your empathy. We've already talked a little bit about early experience, a childhood of maltreatment, for example, but that's not the only route. A second route would be biology, and we should certainly give some time to that. And a third one, as you've pointed out, will be cultural factors, the prevailing political ideology. What
would it mean if we stopped using the word evil and started to talk about 0 degrees of empathy? What would it actually change?
Well, my book is a plea to set aside the term evil, because I don't think it's scientific. I don't think it's doing any work in an explanatory fashion. And I think empathy, in contrast, is an explanatory construct. We can measure it, which is the sort of basis for science, and we can dissect it. We can look at the determinants of it.
Gwen Adshead, you're also writing a book on evil, I think, at the moment, but as somebody who is working at Broadmoor with some of the people who would be described in the newspapers, the popular newspapers, as the most evil people in Britain and so on, do you think that the word evil is useful still?
Well, I do, but for a slightly different reason to the one that we've been talking about. I mean, from my point of view, from our point of view, forensic psychiatry has taken up Simon's ideas with considerable enthusiasm for the last sort of 40-odd years. Indeed, the very reason that Broadmoor exists is the notion that a lack of empathy might be treatable. And that's why we're a hospital of treating rare and unusual conditions in which empathy has been lost. We're a highly specialist treatment service in that sense. But I would want to hold on to the notion of evil for a different purpose, which is that I think it has a performative quality. I think that it's a word of power that people use in certain circumstances to convey a sense of outrage and distress. And I think it may be quite important to hold on to that and to find out, perhaps understand more about what that's for. Because, I mean, the only people I know who use the word evil on a regular basis are judges. And it seems to me a very important part of the social performance that is the criminal court, in which the court is acting on our behalf, to speak on our behalf, because one of our number has been injured and damaged. And I think at that point the use of the word evil is to say we can't bear this. And it's really much more, it seems to me, evil is much more about trying to describe a state of mind that we are in, rather than a type of noun, or indeed a type of categorization of a person.
This question of being treatable, the question of people with 0 degrees of empathy, are they treatable?
Well, you see, I think...
Are they successfully treatable,
I think what's interesting about Simon's work, and I think it's relevant to the clinical population that he's been working with. You see, you've been, as I understand it, Simon, you've been working, of course, you are the international expert on autism and Asperger's and degrees to which people are autistic. Whereas the people that I work with are people who come to our attention because they've done terrible things, and their state of mind becomes a subject, as it were, afterwards. And the question about whether they lack empathy, whether they're autistic, whether they have Asperger's, these are questions that are greatly under the scrutiny. But I don't know anybody in either certainly in the mental health world, and certainly not the scientific mental health world of empiricism study of either pathology or treatment, who would use the word evil. I don't know any such person.
Val McDermid, in your novels you have a profiler called Tony Hill, one of whose main job is to try and think his way inside the minds of people who turn out to be serial killers or do terrible things. And so do you think that there is, A, that the word is useful, but B, that there is anything treatable?
I don't think the word's useful, and I think that it's not just the judges who use this as a sort of sense of outrage. I mean, ordinary people use this. They describe people who commit terrible acts as being evil. And my problem with this really is a social one. People often talk about evil in a non-scientific context. Writers often write about evil as if it's a thing, it's a state of mind, it's something almost you might catch it if you went out without a vest. And they write it as an opposition to good. And in a sense, there's a sort of inevitability about evil. He was born evil. He's always been bad. And I have real problems with that, because to me it seems that is a way of just letting society off the hook. If people are born evil, if this is something that is conditioned by their biology, by their genes, then there's no point in us trying to make society better, because these people are always going to be a problem for us.
So would you prefer empathy as a...
I think it's another useful tool in the box for talking about these kind of things in the general. I think the understanding of the word damage, I like to think of the kind of people who do the terrible things in my book as being damaged, and you can then go in to discuss the ways in which they're damaged and the degree of damage.
And not all damage can be repaired, of course.
No, it can't. Some of it can. And Tony Hill is a great believer in redemptibility. He likes to work with these people. He works in a clinical setting as well as working with the police, and he has at the heart of what he does the belief that there is some kind of redemption for these people. It may not be going back out into the world and living among the rest of us, but there is some way in which their lives can be made better.
Julian Baggini, later on we're going to be talking about your ideas of selfhood. But right at the start we were talking about this notion of somebody having a pot of gold inside them, which is quite close to a notion of the self, which can therefore be good or evil, can be blamed or praised or whatever it is, which you would, a bit like your idea of there being a pearl, there being something absolutely, a kernel, which is identity and selfhood.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the big issue. But as it relates to this specific issue, I think it's quite significant, because, I mean, Wynne says that, evil should be used perhaps as an adjective and not as a noun, which I think is a really nice way of putting it. So I think the problem with the word evil is not that it's never right to describe anything at all in the world as evil. Sometimes that clearly seems to be the only appropriate word. But as a matter of fact, if you look at how it's used when people write in the media in particular and so forth, it's always held up as something which is like completely alien, completely other, and integral to this person. This person is explained away as simply being of another species from the rest of us because they're evil, and that's harmful. But it reflects a general tendency I think we have to essentialise is the term, to basically attribute qualities to a person as though they were just born with them, they're stuck with them, and then they can never change
Cut them through in any direction and you'll find the same stuff.
Exactly, at any time, at any age and so forth. And I think that's not true most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the best case the term evil does a bit of work because it's essentialist, as you say, so it's kind of referring to a theory, maybe a genetic type theory. But in the worst case, I think the term evil is being used, as Val said, as the opposite of good. So it's just another word for bad. And my worry about it, in fact, my sort of criticism of it, is it's probably circular. He did something bad because he's bad. It doesn't really take us any further.
So you didn't write this book, nonetheless, to have a linguistic discussion. You want it to produce different outcomes.
Yeah.
So what different outcomes would you like to see?
As a scientist, what we're always looking for are predictions. that can then be tested and either confirmed or refuted. And that's what gets us out of bed in the mornings. And the term evil just doesn't seem to do that. The term empathy can lead to predictions. So you can measure it, and you make predictions about where different individuals might lie on a scale. You can use different instruments like magnetic resonance imaging to see where empathy might be residing or hiding in the brain. Make predictions about where that might be, and you can look at determinants. You can select genes of interest, to go back to the essentialist idea. But I think most scientists, behaviour geneticists, recognise a gene-environment interaction.
It sounds to me as if one of the main themes is that we should be spending a great deal more time and thought about how we bring up young people, and the importance of that stability and the love and the security early on, and that we pay a huge social price for not spending enough time on that.
That's right. So the geneticists have concluded that the amount of human behaviour, particularly around empathy and callousness, that can be explained by genetic factors is probably only about 30%. So a lot of it is down to environment.
So there's nothing determinist about that. Gwen, you were nodding your head at that.
Well, yes, I mean, I think attachment theory has transformed psychotherapy and psychiatry. Again, it's had a massive effect.
Just for those who don't understand attachment theory, explain it to us.
Well, Simon did a pretty good job of talking about it earlier on, but this is the notion that the building of attachment relationships throughout early infancy between a caregiver and a dependent child, those bonds get built up and represented in both the mind and indeed the brain. But what we know is that actually the development of secure attachments has a direct impact on how the brain develops, particularly the neofrontal cortex. And that's the bit of your brain that regulates not only your emotions but also your experience of yourself, assuming for a moment that there is such a thing as a self, and indeed other people's selves. But without good enough attachments, secure attachments, you become in a risky state of mind vis-a-vis about how you see yourself and regulate your feelings. So it is indeed crucial to empathy, although it's not a complete explanation, because, as I'm sure Simon would say, that just as the genetic influence is only about 30%, so early attachment experiences don't account for all the failures of empathy that we see in adult life.
And I think one of the problems that we have experienced as a liberal society in recent years is through thinking that we're doing the right thing. I really agree with Martin Neary from Barnardo's, who says that we spend far too much time and energy and money working with families who are clearly not ever going to be fixable. So we leave small children in places where they're not being nurtured, where they're not being taught these lessons of attachment and bonding and empathy, and we leave them there for so long that by the time we actually do take definitive action, it's too late. Those children's experiences are already formed and those things are already set in aspect. And maybe we need to start thinking, and I'm probably going to get shot down in flames from all sides on this one, about taking children out of these impossible situations very early on and giving the opportunity to be fostered, to be adopted, to be brought up in an environment where they are going to be loved and wanted, and they're going to learn these lessons, and maybe that will give them a different set of outcomes.
Well, it seems to me that your crime novels, so-called, are in many respects, you would say, sort of campaigning or political novels, in the sense that you are looking at some of the kind of damage and the danger that is randomly out there in society caused by bad upbringing.
I suppose I see that as incidental to what I'm doing. I
suppose
these elements end up in the books because the book reflects who you are as a human being. When you write fiction, however much you try to move away from the events of your own life, the concerns of the writer come through. And so my first concern as a writer is always to tell a story to entertain, because if you don't do that, nothing else matters. But yeah, I care about the world I live in, I care about the environment I live in, and I care about the future of the people we're bringing through in the next generation. I want us to live in a better world than the one I grew up in, hopelessly idealistic though that may sound.
Julian Baggini, let's turn then to the question that's been underlying a lot of this, is the extent to which there is something which is a stable identity or personality to which we can ascribe good or evil, or however we choose to describe it. There have been two different theories of the self, I think it's fair to say, that you describe in your book. Perhaps we could just begin with those, and let's start with the Pearl theory.
Yeah, I mean, these are kind of families of theory. They're tendencies. I mean, the Pearl view, I think, is the one, as I call it, is the one which I think is the common sense one. I think most people have a sense that at the heart of every individual is something which is kind of permanent, unchanging, some kind of essence of who they are. And no matter what might happen in life to do with changes, that's kind of always there. And this is also what gives possibility to the idea of an afterlife which could be eternal, because there has to be something capable of eternally existing in you for eternal life to make possible. But the alternative view to that, which actually comes out in early Buddhist philosophy, it comes out in modern Western philosophy, and I think is what comes out of modern psychology and neuroscience, is rather that this essence just isn't there. That what actually is, we have what's called the bundle view, after a word only used the once by David Hume, actually, but was picked up by other people.
And this is because there's a wonderful description by David Hume of trying to find himself, trying to think. Look in the mirror and discover the person who is looking in the mirror, and it's never there. It's just sensation.
He was like sort of trying to answer Descartes, saying, now, some people say their essence is the most evident thing to them. He goes, for my part, if I try and introspect, I never find myself. I find a thought, a feeling, an emotion. And it's something listeners can try at home. Sit down and just sort of like shut your eyes and see what happens. And for me, it's just like things popping up in your mind. They're connected, sure, but it's just kind of a sequence. And so the bundle theory, it sounds a little bit sort of derogatory and loose, but it really says that we are this kind of collection of thoughts, experiences, memories, and so forth. But we have to remember this is a very remarkably organised collection, and there are various ways in which we bring it together.
You talked earlier on about common sense, and a lot of people will instinctively flinch or revolt from the idea that the 5-year-old Julian Baggini is not in some essential and deep way connected to the Julian Baggini now, or the Julian Baggini you will be when you're 80 years old.
Yes, they will, but at the same time I think people are quite ambivalent on this. And in one of the chapters I looked at, it looks at dementia. And I think dementia, which is terribly, it's an awful thing. When you have people who've had experience of dementia, I think the conflict really comes out in them, because there is a part of them, and people do vary on this, often there's a part of them which sees in the person, even at the late stage of dementia, something of the person they knew, and holds on to the idea that something essential about them is still there. But in other ways, people talk as though, they talk about having already done the mourning before the person has died. You have people who still love their spouses, but they're in another relationship, and they don't consider it to being unfaithful, and it's not being unfaithful because the person they knew really has gone. So, the sense, it's always a question of we are the same in some ways and not in others. There's never a simple answer to the question, are we the same or not? It's not binary in that sense.
Are you therefore saying that what we are is, in essence, or in the end, the stories that we tell about ourselves at any one time?
Almost. I think I would hesitate to reduce it to anything like that. Clearly, it's the autobiographical element, the capacity we have through memory and so forth to create a coherent narrative of our lives is probably one of the most important things in creating that unified sense of self. But I don't want to stress that too much, because it can make it sound as though we can basically therefore tell whatever story we like. These stories are very much determined by our experiences, and there's a limit to how much. So
there are still moral choices and decisions for which we can be praised or blamed, bundle or pearl, because we are telling stories, and how we tell those stories matters.
Yeah, but also, the bundle, we have to remember, is very highly organised, and like this table is an assemblage of parts. I mean, it's not like being an assemblage of parts means that you're not real. I'm very much against the idea of saying that, we're an illusion.
Well, let's turn for a reaction to that from the very highly organised bundle called Gwen Adshead.
Momentarily organised, at least. I suppose what I'm very struck by this, Julian, because I like the work of Dan McAdams, who's a sociologist in Chicago, who has this idea of different layers of the personality, which includes a narrative level. It would include the brain structure, the genetic influences, but would include this narrative level. But what interests me about this is, of course, the extent to which we're unreliable narrators of ourselves. In the world I work in, often the people I meet when they arrive, they come with what I think of as their cover story for what happened. And much of the therapeutic work that we do is about dismantling that cover story and reworking it, as it were, into a thicker version, a thicker story with increasingly other elements in it that include, for example, the victim's story and their future story about what sort of people they might want to be
Well,
in
I was
the
thinking,
future.
you talking about stories, Val's books will include lots of false stories told by damaged and dangerous people.
Yes, and that's one of the art of writing fiction, is to try and weed out who's telling you a verifiable truth, or who's telling you the truth they believe, which is a false truth, and who's just downright lying to you because they
That
want
also
to, because it
takes
saves
place.
the. But I think one of the things about your idea, this notion that we constantly move forward and we constantly remake ourselves, I think it's quite interesting. It's almost like a psychological version of the physical thing, where no part of your body is the same as it was 7 years ago. And I think there's some truth in that. But I think what this bundle, when it's working properly and in an integrated kind of way, what it gives us is a sense of predictiveness. The bundle gives us a sense of we can predict how we will respond in certain situations with a pretty high degree of accuracy. You know, I can predict I'm going to listen to the Today programme tomorrow and shout at the radio. There are things that this sense of ourselves allow us to predict. And it's when we're wrong about that we sometimes get the greatest insights into ourselves. So as a writer, when I'm writing character, one of the ways that I make people stop short and think again about what they're being told and what they're experiencing, is when someone behaves in a way that other characters perceive as being out of character. But when you go back and examine that, in a way, that's the key to what's really going on.
What is it that you are out of? Yes, Simon.
Julian, I think that what you're doing in your book is in some ways quite radical, because you're making people question the very notion of having a self, and we mostly grow up believing that we've got one, and you're telling us...
We have to, don't we?
I think
to operate, we have to believe that we have a self.
Yeah, but I think
construct one.
But I think what Julian's doing is he's saying, well, philosophically, it's hard to justify, and actually the modern neuroscience is also saying it's hard to locate a self in the brain. But my question for Julian was going to be, what's your message to psychiatry? Because psychiatry has this category called personality disorders. And these are meant to be individuals who have an enduring personality trait or set of traits. It's not fluctuating. It's not sort of situational, and they haven't just hurt somebody once. They may have hurt somebody, many different people, successively across their lives. So is that a self?
Well, I think it's a very good question, because the problem I have, obviously, the bundle theory is not new to me. It goes back to Hume. But I found that, particularly recently, a lot of people who are kind of on that side of the debate want to sort of like push the idea that therefore, self-identity are kind of illusions. They're not real. And I'm kind of trying to say the bundle theory actually doesn't mean that. It just means it's not what we think it is. It's not this permanent, unchanging core. But because, there is continuity, there is predictability, and because the narratives we can tell about ourselves can be more truthful and less truthful and so forth, that means that, there are things about the self which are stable enough to function. But I think it's always important to recognise that they're none of them completely permanent. And I think that in psychiatry, there's possibly, and in psychology, there's a danger always of like talking about personality types as though they were just, absolutely permanent and immutable.
Val.
I think one of the ways that we operate with this bundle is that we do choose things. We favour certain aspects over others because that allows us to fit in with a place in the world. And maybe the way to work with people who have these dissociative behaviours, who have these bad behaviours, is to give them the opportunity of having a place in the world that they can enter if they favour one set of behaviours over another. And I'm thinking of a family that I know very well. We all tend to adopt a particular role within the family. That's, I'm the carer, he's the black sheep, all this sort of thing. And a family that I know very well, that I've been very close to, one of the members of that family made a decision recently. She said, this is a bad role for me in this family. I'm not going to be this person anymore because it's not good for me, it doesn't serve me, and I'm changing. And it's that family now, it's like a bomb went off in the middle. Nobody quite knows how to react. And I think that is that issue of choosing within
that
those bundle
exercise
of
of, as it were, free will, and we're not going to go into free will, but that exercise of will, put it that way, had a dramatic effect.
I suppose what I like about your thesis, Julian, is that for me it sits quite easily as a therapist, as a psychological therapist, with the idea of a person as a process of both organising and reorganising, but of course becoming disorganised. So I now think much more in relation to personality disorder about personality disorganisation, and that people can become disorganised at different times. And it's that, and most of the therapy is about helping people to reorganise. And but Simon's quite right. You see, the personality disorder literature at present is quite incoherent, because what it does at present is to put people in categories. And yet then we see people, and I'm thinking in particular, I do a little bit of work with doctors who go off the rails, and these are people who having had perfectly organised lives, then do things that are, quotes, out of character, but I would say they have become disorganised around their role and their identity.
If the idea of evil goes right back to religious ideas, goes back to Zoroaster, I suppose, the dark and the light, the evil and the good fighting eternally across the world, and has influenced many other religions as well. So surely the notion of an unchanging personality is pretty closely related to the idea of soul, the immortal soul. And all the psychotherapists and so on around the table, I just wonder whether what Freud did was he took that and he secularised it. He brought the idea of the unchanging personality and the soul onto the couch and tried to push it into modern science. And what's happening with Julian in his life there is being pushed back out again.
I suppose Freud takes the unconscious, that aspect of ourselves that we don't know, and elaborates it.
There's an underlying truth about every person's story. A sort of post-Freudian and a post-modern take, as you describe in your book, Julian, the idea that the unconscious it seems to me, includes that aspect of ourselves that we can't see, but others may be able to see. And what I'm struck by in these discussions about empathy, and I was struck by in looking at the scale at the back of your book, Simon, is that some aspects of empathy, our own empathy in particular, may not be the best people to be able to rate. That I might rate myself in various ways, but actually people who know me, people who work with me, might rate me more accurately than I am able to do.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with you, Gwen, that empathy is a funny kind of thing, because if you're low on empathy, you might be the last person to know it. So asking you to fill out a questionnaire which is going to deliver a score to describe your empathy may be not applicable, and maybe we should be using different methods to triangulate, to get to a truer picture of someone's empathy. I think the reason why low empathy often goes hand in hand with lack of awareness is that they may be part and parcel of the same thing, that when you empathise, when you're thinking about someone else's mind, you're also thinking about what they might think about you. So you're able to take
These are the mirror cells, or the mirror
but it's
functions.
The mirror neurons may come into it, but I think sort of built into empathy is the idea that you can look at yourself through someone else's eyes. You're not just looking at someone else's mind, but part of what's in their mind might be how they see you. So if you're having difficulty with thinking about someone else, chances are you're also having difficulty with reflective self-awareness.
Which takes us back to this idea of stories, which is the last part of the conversation I think we can go to. Is we all tell stories about ourselves the whole time. We select ruthlessly, say what was important about last year was this and not that, and we all have the experience of sort of wiping out, erasing huge parts of our experience as irrelevant. The bundle theory of self, do we still retain some important sort of moral and character distinctions about the stories we choose to tell? Does that help us?
Well, I think it does, but I think there's one sense which I think we haven't perhaps focused enough on in the conversation, which is the extent to which what happens is driven by situation. Because I think we tend to always think about and tell our stories as though they're entirely character-driven, by this unchanging character for that matter. But I think a lot of work, on evil and loss of empathy and the depersonalisation effects in things like, Nazi Germany, always point out the fact that circumstances and situations have a tremendous power to transform how we feel and how we act. And this is something I sort of was writing about in Simon's book. I mean, it's very important to recognise the factors to do both with genetics and also upbringing and so forth. But is there a danger of understating the extent to which events and situations can really transform the extent to which we feel empathy for others? And
absolutely.
I'm glad you've made space in our discussion for that, because I think the empathy circuit in the brain, we started talking about that at the beginning, it can fluctuate from moment to moment or from situation to situation. So it's not just about early events being partly deterministic, or your genes or hormones being partly deterministic. It's even whether you've had a bad day. If you're feeling tired, if you're a little bit drunk, if you're feeling anxious, it's much harder to keep in mind someone else's thoughts and feelings when you yourself are under situational stress.
Does that mean that you can have, for instance, evil forms of politics when the aggregate, the general level of empathy falls because of a false and dangerous idea which is being propagated?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if we try and put ourselves back into the mindset of Nazi Germany, we also started with that. If your society is sanctioning certain kinds of attitudes, for example, a racist attitude, that can affect not just the individuals who are drafting legislation. It can affect the behaviour of the citizens right through that society.
So does any of this actually change the way we think and act towards one another?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that we are perhaps often very reluctant to accept is that the people around us are the environment that changes. I think the 21st century mind is often very reluctant to accept that being with somebody else, they can have an impact on your brain and mind, and that can generate something that wasn't there before. And following on from what we've just said, my stock example of this is the Wannsee Conference. 60 years ago next year, a group of about 14 perfectly respectable, middle-class, intelligent men who were probably perfectly empathic in other circumstances, sat down together to organise and plan the eradication of a subgroup of the citizenry, for no other reason than because they had an idea that it was a good thing. And in fact, of course, they used scientific evidence to say these are not really people. Pseudoscience, of course, we would call it, but they didn't call it that. And it's something about, for me, what it raises is, how do other people affect my mind? How do group dynamics work? How does that change my narrative? And to what extent can I opt out of those things? But to what extent am I unconsciously affected by them? And how do we monitor that aspect?
Val?
I think often these kind of things are situational, and often they come from either powerlessness or a fear of powerlessness. And I think, for example, a lot of what happened in the Second World War, in the Nazi era, we can put down to scapegoating. Everybody who feels they're cornered wants to blame somebody else. They want to find someone, whether it's the Jews or the homosexuals or the trade unionists or the gypsies, who are somehow the threat that are going to ultimately undermine their position. Now, that's an extreme example, but I think often in everyday life, when people behave in these ways, when they try to cluster around them followers who will accept an idea that for most of us, most of the time, would be unacceptable, it comes from this either a sense of powerlessness or a fear that what little power they have is going to be taken away from them. And I think it comes right back to what you were saying earlier on about that sense of security, that sense of attachment. If you have that pot of gold, then those are not going to be your first recourse.
I'm very struck that, we've been talking about things which a lot of people would regard as challenging to the traditional ways of thinking. We have to think about evil, we have to think about retribution, we have to believe, therefore, in the idea of a single self, a single pearl self that carries on throughout life. And yet, in everything that you're all saying about how we act in the world, you return to quite traditional moral views or ways of acting. Actually, I'm not sure, as I say, that these new ways of describing would change very much about the way society acts.
I think that's a good point, because one of the people I talk about in the book says, that in the thing about in big philosophical transformations is, in lots of ways, they do end up in leaving things the same in practice. But shifts in understanding can be subtle but still very important. I think when it comes to things like criminal justice and so forth, I think people who have the idea that we're not going to attribute any blame to anybody, we're not going to do any punishment, we're going to treat people as though they were simply products of what's going on in their brain, that's nonsense. It wouldn't work. But the subtle shift, when you move away from just thinking about people for whom their upbringing and their brains and all these things have nothing to do with what they're doing, so really appreciating that, I think, can bring around a more humane and practical criminal justice system.
Gwen, you work with a lot of these people, you've worked with these people.
I think that is quite important, because I think there was a notion, in a way, Broadmoor and those Victoria asylums were all built on the notion that once you were mad, and you would be put there and you wouldn't move. They had a sort of oubliette function. Now, 100 years on, we don't see mental health and mental disorders in those ways anymore. And we think that those people who are damaged whose mental health is seriously damaged, it may be recoverable from. In fact, a lot of people will recover from their mental disorders. But a few people may be so damaged. And I was thinking, when you were talking, I was thinking of that wonderful quote by Josephine Hart, the title of her book, "Damaged people are dangerous. They know they can survive." And so it seems to me there's something here about trying to provide opportunities for people to recover and reorganise, if possible. And what we don't know, I think, sometimes in the world that I work in the hospital we work in, is this enough? Has this person changed enough? Can we trust what they say about themselves in relation to what they did and how they feel? That seems to me to be but that's a fundamental human philosophical problem. How do you trust what somebody says to you? And does one single act of violence, or several acts of violence, make you an unreliable narrator for the rest of your life?
Well, and you wouldn't, Simon, have focused on empathy and 0 degrees of empathy if you didn't believe that at least sometimes it was possible to jack up 0 degrees to some degrees of empathy at least.
I think empathy is a skill like any other human skill, where if you get a chance to practice it, if you get a chance to learn more about it, it can improve. So nothing is fixed. But Gwen is reminding us, and I think this is what comes out of the neuroscience perspective on acts of cruelty, that maybe when someone has low empathy and does something cruel, rather than putting them in prison, we should be looking at them within the health service. So if we think of empathy deficits or as a disability, no different to being in a wheelchair sometimes, we wouldn't necessarily want to punish someone for not being able to walk. We would want to understand their disability and see how we can remediate.
Oh.
I'm often struck by Gwen quotes one of her patients as saying, "You can be an ex-bus driver, but you can never be an ex-murderer." And in an ideal world, I would like us to move towards a position where nobody felt in quite that desperate place ever again. And at the risk of sounding facile, what ultimately will redeem us is love, and love early enough.
Well, I think what's interesting about this discussion here is I think it shows how all these issues to be understood do really require people to come together. And I think it's a real shame sometimes. One of the sort of frustrations and reasons for doing my book was that there's so much of interest to be said about what makes us who we are and our capacity to behave the way we do, but it's all being said by different people in different fields. And in the modern world, the way knowledge is organised, often those things are not brought together. And it's really, and people like Val as well, novelists have bring something really to the table here, which I think we all need to listen to.
Well, I think love and pots of gold is a very good place to end on. So thank you to all my guests today. Val McDermid's latest Tony Hill and Carol Jordan novel will be out in September. Do you know what it's going to be called yet?
Well, I think it's going to be called Unredeemable, but my editor thinks something different.
Well, we'll find out who wins that one later on. Gwen Adshead's in the middle of writing her book on evil.
I am indeed.
And Julian Baggini's book, The Ego Trick, and Simon Baron-Cohen's 0 Degrees of Empathy are both out now. Next week, the Turkish artist Kutlug Ataman on the symbolism of Mesopotamia and the art of sketching with Britain's very own Michael Craig Martin. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, some of the most fundamental questions of all today. What is evil and who are we anyway? Simon Baron-Cohen, the psychologist and psychiatrist, is here to challenge the idea of human evil. It is, he believes, a phrase which hides the real story, which is a radical lack of empathy in some people, a story which can be traced in the brain. Gwen Adshead is a consultant forensic psychotherapist at Broadmoor, working with some of the most dangerous people in the country, and she defends the use of the word evil, while Val McDermid, one of the country's most successful and lauded crime writers, brings a novelist's eye to the question of empathy and evil. You may have noticed, however, that responsibility for evil or anything else can hardly be disentangled from the question of identity. Who are we, really, to be blamed or praised? Julian Baggini's new book, The Ego Trick, argues that we are not a core, a single self, but a bundle, a series of stories. If somebody does something that's out of character, well, what is character? Let's start with Simon and the theory of empathy. Simon, we, I guess, are mostly familiar with the idea that if you don't understand or you're not interested in what is going on in other people's minds, then you are likely to be socially inept and possibly also to be cruel. We can see that. But you argue that there is a specific series of actions in the brain or functions in the brain which adds up to what you call an empathy circuit.
That's right. I think what's been exciting over the last 5 to 10 years in neuroscience is that we've made real progress in identifying. So it's also a puzzle because we need science to be able to explain behaviour, even the extreme acts. So in a sense, what neuroscience has been doing is looking at which parts of the brain empathy may be operating in. And the short answer is it's not in a single part. It seems to be distributed across a whole network of regions. And in my new book, I identify 10 different regions of the brain, which I call the empathy circuit. And if different parts of that circuit go down in different ways, you can produce different outcomes of unempathic behaviour.
So this is something that you can actually observe in the brain, and also it has some relation to how people have been brought up. It's not simply, as it were, a disease, a malfunction of the brain. It's something caused by upbringing.
Well, there are two separate issues. So one is finding which regions of the brain are involved when somebody is trying to figure out what someone else is thinking or feeling, or responding to someone else's thoughts and feelings. And that's really my everyday working definition of empathy, the recognition part, recognising someone else's mental state, but also the reaction, the response, caring about someone else's mental state.
And you started on this project thinking back to the Nazi treatment of Jews and the Holocaust and asking yourself how it was that people could do such unspeakable things to other people.
That's right. I mean, for someone who's Jewish, as I am, it's a significance that never really goes away right through your life, even if you haven't experienced it firsthand. So the question about how people are capable of acts of cruelty towards other human beings is a puzzle. But for me, I'm a working cognitive neuroscientist. We all have degrees of empathy. So empathy isn't all or none. It comes by degrees. And the people who catch the media's fascination and draw public horror are people at 0 degrees. But actually, people who are at 0 degrees don't always commit cruel acts, and certainly people on the autistic spectrum are not, as a group, more likely to commit cruel acts, even though they struggle with empathy, struggle with understanding other people. But, so the idea is that we're all somewhere on an empathy curve, a bell curve, and part of what the book tries to do is understand what determines where you end up on that empathy spectrum. You mentioned upbringing. And I'm sure we'll have some discussion about that, because there's plenty of evidence that early experience of neglect